a little bit of context what we're going to be discussing today. So welcome to this SERA Global Witness and Global Canopy event, Green Future, Labour's Blueprint, Nature Positive Economy. Jude, Green Finance Institute. We're a non-profit by the UK government to advise on the financial system, greening the economy, work on nature. I'm also a Labour councillor in the City of Westminster and also an advisor to the Labour Climate and Environment Forum. So multiple hats that I'm wearing here today. We have a brilliant lineup of speakers who I'll introduce in a second. But firstly, just a few brief remarks from me to set the scene for this panel and what we're hoping to cover today. So firstly, as everyone in this room knows, it's widely acknowledged that we now live under the twin crises of the climate and ecological emergencies. Yet, although climate is often prominent now in discussions in financial services firms, corporates, in policy debates, unfortunately, often lags slightly behind in those discussions. So today, as we see nature increase, we're going to start to set what a Labour government could potentially look to include in its blueprint or its green print. It's worth saying here that the level of the financial system and economy's dependence on nature is often not as widely discussed when we're talking about the impacts of biodiversity loss. Yet 55% or $58 trillion of global GDP is classed as reliant on nature. Almost 3/4 of the FTSE All-Share in the UK is class reliant. Therefore, nature needs for Treasury and for the Bank of England regulators, but also for private sector firms that are operating out of the City of London. There is progress being last year. International leaders negotiated the global biodiversity for 2030 date biodiversity loss and also to stop biodiversity loss by 2030. And has also announced a net zero spending in the trailed over the last couple of years. Details we are still waiting to see. Perhaps we'll get some of them on this panel today. But importantly, the UK is the largest financial centre in the world. It has global reach, global impact, and a lot of the activities that go on in the City of London are extractive growing nature further afield. And so we have a responsibility to also, as the government and regulators, look to support the rest of the world in that. So there are many topics that we can focus on in today's panel, but that hopefully sets out some of the areas that we're going to be touching on. And from here on out, you'll be hearing from our wonderful panelists. So we have Veronica Oakeshott, who's the head of the Forest Campaign at Global Witness and a Labour councillor for Newham. We've got Helen Bellfield, Policy Director at Global Canopy and the Deputy Director of Trace. Nick Molho, who this year has joined Aviva Investors in the newly created role of Head of Climate Policy, following his previous role leading the Aldersgate Group, which I'm sure he'll talk about some of their work later. And we're also very lucky to be joined by Alex Sobel, who plays an instrumental role in putting nature at the forefront of Labour's climate policy, including the nature test that I mentioned earlier. So to start with, let's just take a bit of a step back. And before we begin to talk about the detailed policy, I can just turn to Veronica, just ask what we actually mean when we say the financing of biodiversity loss or deforestation. Give an example of the scale of this in UK.
Sure. So I'll focus on deforestation. So I can really hard understand what are the financial flows going from the UK to businesses abroad and specifically to businesses engaged in tropical deforestation. And much of tropical deforestation is driven by agribusiness, commodities like palm oil, soy, beef production. And there are a number of agribusiness companies which time and time again, Global Witness in our investigative reports are exposing for deforestation. So we know that these are essentially rogue business when it comes to deforestation and human rights practices, and so should the finances. So there is no that. what are financial flows going from the City of London to repeat offenders. I did the first big piece of research on this in the run-up to the Glasgow COP, and we found in the 5 years between the Paris COP, so between 2015 and 2020, the City of London was ploughing 16.6 billion into the top 20 known deforestation companies. Now, just to put that in perspective, so big numbers, many of you may be very competent at kind of imagining them, but certainly for me, I find it quite useful to compare it to other to sense of perspective. So the Amazon Fund has recently put into it Switzerland and the US. Now the Amazon, and in its 14 years of history, it's had 1/10 its total donations to the Amazon Fund of 1.6 billion. UK alone is sending foresting businesses. But when you consider about the kind of positive finance that you'll hear a lot about in these kind of spaces, and you also think about those flows, that those foresting companies are well to deforest as part of their business model, there's an imbalance, and that's what we at Global Witness are trying to address. And if you start, I've said 16.6 billion in here, but the experts are those levels are even higher. So as you said, about causing those environmental harm we're effectively exporting through our financial industries.
Thanks so much, Veronica. You've outlined there the scale, and the scale is large. Our impact is huge. So, turn to you. Obviously, we're currently in time over the past years, getting on the agenda. So, Mark, I'm just giving a bit of information.
So, anything I say, but I'm on the SERA exec. I just want to give a big shout to Lisa. Just agenda has rocketed up Labour's agenda. Not saying that it wasn't. We can go right to Scott and Kyoto a long time ago, but it is right at the forefront now. And nature is absolutely core part of that. It isn't just climate; it's climate and nature. I think that the act in terms of legislative wins, it has been fairly thin gruel. But the Environment Act was strengthened by Labour. The Environment Improvement Plan, the government's Environment Improvement Plan, is in and of itself not a terrible plan to deliver. It's just the government is completely unable to deliver it in any useful way, shape, or form. And the way and people, there's a lot of people in this room I've worked with the last 2 years and I've heard this before. Labour's view is that Environment Improvement Plan creates a floor, not a ceiling of ambition. Targets are not maximalist, which I think is how the government views them. They're minimalist. So either we'll over deliver them, or we'll deliver them. We'll over deliver them earlier, so we'll over deliver them by because we're not just going to stop at the date. So, but either way you want to view it, that's the policy approach. That was my policy approach. That will continue to be the policy approach. There's no reneging from that, even though the team has changed. And I think that that's where we start. But there are huge issues, particularly around regulation, and particularly about things that conflict between government departments. We won't say any more than that now. We'll probably get into that later.
All right, thanks, Alec. Nick, if I tell you next, you've obviously had several roles in your career, recently leaving civil society to go into the private sector. How are you looking at this, and how are you see emerging regulations?
Ryan, it's been around for 325 years, around for to 18.5 million customers, which means that we are a business that's long term. Climate crisis, nature crisis, core issue. We have a 2040 net zero emissions target, and supply chains is for within that nature restoration, biodiversity restorations, or core issues that we want to tackle. So for us, it's really part and parcel of the same. I think there's a lot of momentum in the run up COP26 to put lots of groundwork in place to have a net zero financial centre in the UK. There's been some progress, some groundwork's been done, developing a green taxonomy to help cut through greenwashing and helping investors and what are not sustainable investments, but that work has stalled to a degree. The transition, net zero transition plans has sort of seen some progress, but we're not, I think, quite there yet in terms of having a complete, fully implemented sustainability disclosures regime in the UK. So what we'd really like to see over the next months is all the different elements of sustainability disclosure coming together so that investors and business have a framework to understand how different businesses are doing on their. I think first of all, let's get that right. We also like to see is a much nature within that sustainability disclosure framework. The focus was very much on climate in the initial years, and that was completed enough. But now, as we're really on developing that sort of work and understand measure biodiversity, also improving. A few weeks ago, the task force for nature-related financial disclosures, also known as TNFD, publishes recommendations and basically outline in a very sort of simple way how businesses of all sizes and across all sectors could go about putting in place clear government structures, clear strategies to manage biodiversity and on nature, including abroad, and the kind of metrics and sort of internal solutions they could put in place to manage those impacts. So we'd be really keen to see sort of businesses and investors starting to adopt those in the months and years to come. So I'll probably leave it there for now.
Thanks, Nick. So Helen, if I turn to you, we just heard about some of the emerging regulations in the UK, some of the international voluntary approaches, but I think it's safe to say we're perhaps a little bit behind the EU in some of this regulatory environment. What's happening over in the EU, and is there anything we can learn from them in the UK?
Yes, so thank you. So I think, firstly, as Alex said, the EU has moved a lot quicker on its deforestation regulation, and at the same time the Environment Act has been the primary regulation has been published. The EU's managed to get through a whole proposal, publish it and move on it, and we're still waiting for the critical secondary regulations here. I think more broadly, and maybe to take a step back, we've talked a lot about climate and nature crises here and at the conference more broadly, but it's critical to recognise that the nature loss, particularly deforestation, is also associated with human rights abuses. It's very hard to do, so it's critical that regulations are also looking at that element as well. So human rights is particularly affect Indigenous peoples and local communities in the context of tropical deforestation, but also workers' rights, slave labour, endemic in a lot of these supply chains. So on that, in the EU, there's a lot of acronyms here, so I'll try and spell it out. But the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is moving the EU forward beyond just disclosure and into a legal framework that will require companies operating in the EU to do mandatory due diligence obligations on environmental impact and human rights impacts. That hopefully will cover the financial sector, but it's currently in a trilogue and negotiation, which we hope to get over the line at the end of this year. And what due diligence means in this context, because I know there's a lot of jargon, is basically companies will have to prevent, mitigate, and account for any harm and adverse impacts on environment and human rights in their financing and supply chains. So I think that's the sort of direction we'd hope to see the UK and the Labour government move to, is progressing on due diligence to extend to the finance sector. And there's hopefully opportunities in that from the Finance Services and Markets bill discussions, but also to make sure that human rights doesn't get left behind.
Great, thanks. So there's certainly a lot of acronyms in this space, and apologies if we don't explain any of them. Please do feel free to ask during the Q&A. So to add one, the FSMB is just mentioned at the end there, Financial Services and Markets Bill. I know that Global Witness did a lot of work with Labour around the amendment that got through the House of Lords on this. And if you want to just provide a bit more information on what this entails.
Yeah, sure. So we worked on an amendment that would require UK financial institutions to enact due diligence to check effectively if their investments were funding deforesting businesses and not to fund deforesting businesses. And the Labour front bench supported that amendment, which was absolutely brilliant. We managed to get it, progress it through both houses to the to win a vote in the Lords, which was great. And then obviously, ping pong happened, and as it does, it fell. But what we did get from it was a commitment from the government to review. To conduct a Treasury-led review, which was really important, actually, to look at whether the existing regulations in the UK were enough to stop UK financiers causing deforestation destruction abroad. And we know what the answer is going to be. We know what the answer is going to be, not only because Global Witness has been working on this for a very long time, but also because the government has set up something called the UK Global Resource Initiative, chaired by former Barclays chair. And that GRI, Global Resource Initiative task force, which was commissioned by the UK, told them the answer to this new question already. The regulation does not yet exist to adequately prevent UK financiers from causing deforestation destruction abroad. So we do know what the answer is, but nonetheless, we're happy to have that question again, because the Treasury is not being a task force. It's happening in-house by the Treasury, and we hope that will stimulate civil servant minds as to actually practically what will it look like. And I think going forward, if there is a change of government, hopefully that thinking can be absorbed and turned to a law, that same law that the front bench supported over this last 12 months. And that same law, by the way, which the majority of Britain supported, continue to support. So we've just commissioned some research from YouGov. And if you want to commission your own research, by the way, visit the Global Witness stall just around the corner from here, and they're doing a competition, and the winners put in a question for free. But anyway, a little plug for Global Witness. But YouGov showed that 60% of the British public believe that there should be a regulation to stop British financiers ploughing money into tropical forest destruction. So I think, if a new Labour government would be pushing at an open door on this one.
Alex, a new Labour government will be pushing an open door on this one. So would a new Labour government take these principles forward?
So I'm going to give a few secrets to Shadow Minister. Not all Shadow Ministers operate the same way. So yes, then the rub is, how do we do it? We're not going to have a bill on this, clearly. This is an amendment to an existing bill. So is there a bill that we can hang on that's going to be in the manifesto and going to be in the first King's speech? No, honestly, but we'll see when we have the first King's speech under the new Labour government. Secondly, you can, through the instrument process, amend existing legislation. So with financial markets and bill, and retrospectively legislate to amend it. there's generally a sort of presumption that bill's been passed very recently, you don't immediately amend it, but had a change of government, so those rules don't necessarily apply. And I think that did happen a little bit at the beginning of the last Labour government, where they were pushing things at the back end of the major government, didn't get them through in exactly the same sort of way, and went, we haven't got a bill for this, but we want a commitment, so we just retrospectively amend that legislation through. So the trick is, what, in the manifesto, I think we're sort of on the way. Veronica, I think we're on the way there. And secondly, it's, what's the mechanism to do it? And actually, shadow ministers really, the jobs and take. The shadow secretary of state gets to make the big strategy. To know how to make things happen. So that's the sort of why I meet with people like Veronica all the time, because it's how we make things happen.
Thanks, Alec. Am I right? Is that the first time you've publicly said that you might try and get that into the manifesto? If so, it's a great scoop for everyone who's come along today.
No, we're trying to get it in. It's not in.
Trying to get it in, of course. All the caveats, of course.
Well, the MPF document is I think, has it been published or not officially yet? So have a look in there. Is the answer. I'm not the shadow minister anymore, so so it's not my direct responsibility.
Thanks, Alex. So, Helen, if it does get introduced in the first King's Speech under a Labour government, how practical is this? Is it something that financial institutions can implement immediately?
The answer there, I think, is a yes. So as Nick said, and I will hopefully talk a little bit about what Aviva is doing this, because I'm moving on. I'll let him speak. On nature more broadly, it is much more, as Nick said, the Force and Nature Disclosure is just publishing some recommendations, but on deforestation, there's a lot of open access, publicly available data already available. So Global Canopy, we work on data on deforestation. It's our bread and butter. So we have the Forest 500, which has been going now for 10 years, that identifies and assesses the exposure of companies, so the 500 companies with the biggest to tropical deforestation, and what their policies and actions are to address that. We also co-run supply chain transparency, these supply chains. Companies should know where they're buying things from. They should know where they're sourcing things from, and whether those ingredients are associated with deforestation, human rights, whether they're legal or not. I already know that financial institutions are starting to adopt. So the leaders, Aviva being one of them, have made commitments to have deforestation-free portfolios by 2025. They are already using this data to screen their portfolios, to engage these companies, and to shift towards that. So I think that answers the question, that this is possible. It's more of resources and motivation, and hopefully regulation to push, as I said, to push a sector has a more level playing field, and this just becomes business as usual.
Thanks, Helen. As you mentioned that, Nick, it'd be great to hear you how some of these measures are on it.
Thank you. Just on the due diligence point, we saw the mandatory on the panel on that campaign, and I think it would match the other due diligence requirements which already exists through the environment, which is focused on retailing at where they source their products. So having a similar sort of due diligence requirement financial institution would really sort of help close the gap and make sure we have a much more watertight sort of system on due diligence. We're sort of ahead of the introduction of those requirements. We've decided to just go ahead anyway with efforts to really tackle deforestation. Back in 2021, we were one of only 35 financial institutions, unfortunately, stood up to the financial sector deforestation action. What that means in practice is that we've committed to use all best efforts to eliminate agricultural commodity-driven deforestation by 2025. Now, what that means in practice is that when you sign up to something like that and you set yourself that kind of objective, you then have to do a very detailed risk assessment. So we carried out a deforestation risk assessment using a wide range of indices, including also such as the forests, Spot, and Forest Watch in particular. And that allowed us to do was to identify the of things which could have exposure to deforestation. What we then did was to drill down that be at risk of being exposed to deforestation, but financial institutions, and in particular banks. So what we then did was to assess the of when it comes to deforestation and the governance structures when it comes to deforestations, businesses and financial institutions have place. And we rated those, and we found that about 38% of them had weak management structures on deforestation and weak policies in place to tackle it. So what we did then on the back of that was able to inform our voting strategy and our engagement strategy with a wide range of corporates. It resulted in us voting against 75 management resolutions last year, focused on companies that are exposed to deforestation and, according to our assessments, have poor policies and deal with it. We think that engagement is critical to get them to really sort of change course on deforestation. And we identified 5 of the most sort of worst performers on the banking side and 5 on the retail side that we are working doubly hard on to make sure they progress a lot more quickly, because they came as the sort of the worst performers within our risk assessment. So when you have all this to say that when you set yourself a goal, or when you're required by legislation to drive out deforestation, you have to undertake really robust risk assessment, which then inform your engagement policy, your voting policy, and allows you to really have an impact on those companies that have a significant bearing on potential deforestation, but also abuses that can happen in those commodity supply chains.
Thanks, Nick. It's good to hear about some of the practical actions that are being taken to really factor this in. I'm going to, in a second, open out to the audience, so please just have a think if you have any questions. But finally, just Alex, I just want to go up a bit from the very specific policies that we've been talking about. We've obviously, as you said, Alex, it's climate and nature that's really important, but we've seen a green industrial strategy being started where investors' climate can go. Can we expect any similar long-term firm commitments for nature?
I think so. So, and you talked about the Labour's climate nature tests. So there will be 2 separate sets of tests: climate tests and nature tests, or net zero tests and nature tests. Those, not by me, but they will be written and set out. But the sort of point where we're thinking we're working on the same sort of principles: the natural history museums, biodiversity, intactness index, and looking at the sort of principles that stood behind that. So biodiversity will be the heart of the nature test. So that's the sort of principle we're working on. There will be direct capital investments part of GPP. It's one of the, I think it's 8. There's 8 points. Ask me what all 8 are, particularly at the moment, within the GPP, and nature is one of those. But actually, and this is guided by talking to a lot of people in this room, a lot of people in the investment sector and the finance sector, having chat with Ryan about green taxonomy. Yep. We need to get that in, don't we?
That's all we ever talk about.
Yeah, it's all we ever talk about. You know, we need to have the right regulatory framework. If we have the right regulatory framework, that will unlock private sector investment, which is much more important. At the moment, actually, you know, so I'll give one specific example before we open up. So the aviation industry utilizes natures for carbon offset. So this sector is completely unregulated. So we've had, I won't name any airlines, particularly as I'm not in Parliament, I don't have parliamentary privilege at a conference, but, you know, there have been purchases of land, of uphill farming land for tree planting, displacing traditional sheep farming. You can have views about that, but not appropriate sites. and actually the trees don't really take in those sort of places. You know, whereas if we had regulation, we had land use framework, which is Labour policy, and needs to be in work on that is being led in the laws by Barbara Young, RS Young, a Labour peer. And again, that is something that's informing Labour's front bench work on land use. It's all domestic policy. I notice Veronica's writing it down. We're not going to run a land policy for Brazil. That's up to travel, and you know, we can unlock money for nature, both capital and revenue, actually, if we have the right regulatory framework, if we have the right signals, and we don't allow this huge sort of regulatory gap that just exists at the moment.
Amazing, thanks, Alex. So we've got about 20 minutes for audience Q&A, and I'll ask the panelists to give some final reflections. Please put your hand up if you have any questions in the audience. Don't all jump at once. There we go, man back there. There's a mic coming to you. Please introduce yourself and say your name, please.
Where are you from?
And we'll take these in threes, so please keep your hand up.
Yeah, I think it's on. Can you turn it up, Lewis?
Hello, yeah.
There we go.
I'm Adrian from the New Forest East CLP. So for Aviva really is that if you are going to do this type of, things about not trying to do financial packages, and on your Aviva pensions, you've got loads and loads of different things that you can select. Are you going to make it clear to them as when they do that?
Yeah.
What is ethical? What is unethical? What is or are you just going to remove those packages out so that you can't actually pick them?
So that's a very good question.
Should we take a couple more? One further down this row, and then we'll have a third at the back there afterwards. Just the one here, please.
Thanks very much. Kira Box from Friends of the Earth. There's been a lot of conversation about deforestation from the panel, and I just wanted to check in. That doesn't mean we're focusing. Yeah, this mic's really dubious. This doesn't mean that we're focusing only on deforestation. This could be looking for environmental impact. That look at a company's impact across the panel's communities, to hold companies liable, hold them down, and to get issues solved and get restitution when there is damage.
Great, thanks. I had one at the back there.
Thanks. Melissa Moore, Oceana. So just a question made for Alex for the salty half of the UK, which is actually the vast majority. It's more like about 70% of the UK. The one ask we've had for a long time for nature, as you know, is a well-managed marine protected area network. And so from your time on the shadow bench, do you think it to controlling marine protected areas, and whether it's through implement through the excellent marine action in 2009 or another way, but just if you've any indication on that actual commitment. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I think I'll turn to you for the first question, then Veronica and Helen for the second one, and Alex for the end. So Nick on the first question, please.
Yeah, well, great question. I've had a lot of discussions with the Aviva pension team, with whom I also have my pension, so it's a live topic. So the sense of the trouble for us is completely clear. We want to have a net zero investment portfolio by 2040, which means that everything we invest, including pensions, has to be aligned. And within that, we are looking to maximize investment on nature positive, biodiversity positive, and we signed up to the deforestation actions precisely to eradicate any sort of links with deforestation as part of that. And for that, we're focused on 2025, which is why we're doing all these risk assessments at the moment. So the Aviva investment direction is dictated, if you like, by those targets. Obviously, a supportive policy environment helps, especially when it comes to the net zero sort of transition. There are things we would like to invest in, but projects are not coming forward. So, for instance, if you are digressing too much from the topic, if you want to invest in a say green cement plant today, it's quite difficult because there's no green cement projects to invest in because the policy is not right yet. So, but that's why we also invest in advocacy with government to try and change that. When it comes to the disclosure, to the other aspect, which is how do you give more visibility to consumers, we're also really looking at that. What we're trying to do is to provide consumers with the ability in the here and now to understand the carbon impacts of their portfolio and the different options available to them if they want to right now, with the portfolio as it is today, to sort of go to the most sustainable end possible. So those are things that are also being looked at. And we've actually sort of, in the last 2 or 3 years, issued a range of sustainability funds to help make it easy for consumers to select those. On the disclosure points, yeah, I completely agree that it's important that we look at of nature rather than isolation. Otherwise, you can have an impact. And I think that's around finishing the development of the sustainability disclosures requirement framework in the UK. It should cover net zero and the whole transition to net zero, but it should also cover a wide range of nature-related impacts. Everything sort of from biodiversity net gain to soil deterioration to deforestation and others. So I think the vision is very much to try and capture a range of over time within that. I think from the investor and business perspective, though, what's important is to try and have as much of this same place as possible. Otherwise, you risk disclosure overlap, disclosure of, so to bring people with us and to make sure that we maximize goodwill to do this properly, trying to have everything as part of the same integrated framework would really help.
So Nick, just to summarize, the answer to the will you provide clarity to consumers is yes, but you still need some regulations to also help with that.
Yeah, I mean, especially if we want the rest of the market to do it with us as well. Exactly.
Yep. So the second question, I think, Kiri, you're right to say that we have focused on deforestation in this discussion, but to Veronica and to Helen, we're going to also factor in everything else as well, and how we empower communities to be able to use this information. I'll send you first.
Sure. Yeah, I think the question is a really good one and a fair one. I think it's really important to get that corporate sustainability due diligence. It's ahead in the EU than it is in the UK, and that's something we at Global Witness would love to see progress on. Deforestation legislation is ahead in terms of its progress through Parliament, in terms of amendments, for example, in the Financial Services and Markets Bill, and government interest, and so it has the potential to be a kind of pioneer, I think, not least because of the amount of available data there is. That Helen will tell you more about, meaning that there is no excuse for companies to not do the right thing on deforestation. So yes, I think we should be starting with deforestation because, as I say, there's an open door. We had financiers with 2.7 trillion assets under management sign up to say, yes, we agree this law is needed for deforestation. We've got political agreement, or some political agreement anyway. We've got public agreement, as I said, with the polling. So I see this as a pioneer law, one that has great implications for nature because deforestation is, of course, so much part linked with habitat and all implications that brings for nature. But absolutely, we do need wider regulation, and human rights absolutely has to be part of that. Human rights abuses and deforestation go hand in hand, sadly. We see communities driven from their lands in order to make space for big agri projects. We absolutely see the need for border legislation too.
Great, thanks. Helen, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just super briefly. So I think the task force for nature-related financial disclosures is starting to set what disclosure starts to look like in other areas. It has been very much work at all. I think on deforestation, we're ready to move to due diligence, and I think that ties to the second part of your question on the liability and substantiated concerns and the need for clear grievance mechanisms and penalties in legislation, which means that as well as assessing risks, where they are found, they need to be mitigated and accounted for, and remediation where those impacts have already taken place as well. So I think that also speaks to moving beyond just disclosure and moving towards accountability and due diligence, and the need to do that in regulation. But I think we're able to do that much quicker on deforestation because we're much further ahead in terms of the data requirements.
To briefly abuse my position as chair, TNFD and the taxonomy, we've been working on that at GFI, and I can assure you that a lot more in deforestation is going into those. It's just the levels at which different parts of it are currently. Alex, MPAs.
Yeah, I'm going to address the second one as well because you give me a chance to talk about one of my hobby horses. But on MPAs, I'm really well aware of the mechanism that we just need statutory on the 2009 Act, and one of the, and sort of coming back a little bit to the second question, one of the things that that I was looking at, was concerned about, was the destruction and effectively the barriers for us to restore seagrass and kelp through things like bottom trawling and dredging in our waters. So I've got a huge amount of sympathy, but I'm not the shadow minister anymore, so I can't tell you whether it is or not. But it was something that I met with a lot of people about, and we were thinking about it and thinking about how to do it. And it is a fairly easy legislative process. It's interesting because my role was divided amongst 3 people, which maybe says something about me. But that is now that bit, the oceans bit, now sits with Emma Hardy. So she's got flooding and oceans, and she's an MP in Hull, which is under real threat of flooding. But it might be worth, meeting with Emma and just having a chat about this, because I'm not sure this is on her radar yet, because she's, obviously just a very brand new shadow minister. On the second one, so, and I know that Friends of the Earth are aware of this, I've spoken to them about it. I'm the chair of the West Papua Party group, and this is a really good example. So in West Papua, the Indonesians are, there is large-scale deforestation for infrastructure, for palm oil. But actually, probably the biggest issue, ecological issue, and they are big campaigners in West Papua around ecocide and stopping ecocide, is resource extraction and mining. And I went this year to the United Nations Human Rights Commission to meet with special rapporteurs about this, including the Environment Rapporteur, though he was in Canada, so he only did it online. But anyway, what it creates issues around internally displaced people. It creates issues around people's cultural rights. It creates issues around destruction of housing. Creates issues around destruction of education and education opportunities. So all of these issues around biodiversity, due diligence, are wrapped up in human rights really strongly. And I've just been back, so slightly aside, I've just been back from Uzbekistan, and they, in their constitution, have outlawed, and obviously due diligence important about this, outlawed child labour and something else I can't remember because I haven't eaten enough, but something else which means that their cotton is significantly better than other people's cottons in human rights terms. I'm not sure about environmental terms. And so again, you can see in terms of ethical supply chains, there are differences, and actually countries take constitutional and legal steps internally might give them advantage in terms of supply relations here and being able to sell ethically. I think we're not in a place yet where we're going to start banning cotton products, not going against any retailers, but they're quite, got some low cost retailers, fast fashion, all of that, where it's really poor practice. So all of these issues are wrapped up in each other.
Thanks, Alice. I think we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more right at the front here, please. And then also at the front. Sorry, everyone.
Hi there. Graham Meeks from Corio Generation. We're an offshore wind developer that has its roots in the Green Investment Bank. I guess my question's mostly for Alex. We've get your pen out. The government has signalled that it is planning now to legislate to implement biodiversity net gain at the end of this year. I'd be interested to understand, what your vision is for how biodiversity net gain can be used good and to deliver that 10% improvement, but also whether we're going to properly resource the regulators so that we can have some integrity in those regulations when they take effect.
Thanks. At the front here with the laptop.
Hi, thanks so much. My question for all of the panel. So I think it's really interesting to hear about the work with Aviva and showing people their portfolios and how they might be able to make adjustments to impact the carbon. What we often hear as pushback for investment choices is that shareholders want to make profit, and so the people's hands are effectively tied. I'm not sure that's true, and I wonder if the panel have any thoughts on how shareholders might be motivated to look outside of just making profits and actually look to how their investments are performing.
Thanks. I'm sure there'll are plenty of those. I think we do probably have time to just take one more in this round. Can we just go just on your left there?
Matthew, the mic's not working. So
Do you want to shout?
Hi, I'm Kat from the Design Council with National Strategic Advice on Design, product designers to landscape and architects. You spoke a lot about data, investment, regulation, all critical things to really increase nature. What about the other things that are needed? I'm thinking about in terms of skills and education and the people who are actually going to be doing the work on the ground in our rural communities and our urban communities to get nature back.
Thanks, Kat. So we'll take the second and third afterwards. But Alex, firstly for you, biodiversity net gain. And I must say, as a local councillor, where we've just declared an ecological emergency, I really want the answer to this. So please let us know what Labour's plans are.
Well, so this is sort of maybe I was alluding to a little bit earlier. So there are some. Let me try to put this in the right way, being politic about it. There are issues that rub up between DEFRA and not between DEFRA and Energy and Net Zero, but those two teams and maybe the department for DLUC, as it's called, particularly around housing and planning. And I think the approach we're going to take probably follows the quite controversial decision by the government to scrap nutrient neutrality, which is mainly an issue in rural areas, but also mainly in our national parks and ANOBs. And it's just, anyway, but Labour very, very quickly, within 48 hours, came to the decision to oppose the government's scrapping of nutrient neutrality. Oh, the lights come on. So I think that in terms of biodiversity net gain, our sort of approach is going to be the same. So actually, you could say, well, biodiversity net gain, that's an impediment to house building, which Labour, obviously, we've got housing. In Westminster, you've got a huge housing crisis. Yeah. But equally, not that many green spaces. So we need to balance those two things. So I was a local councillor before I was an MP, and when in planning process, what really annoyed me was that developers always try and find a low-cost way to off-site their obligations under biodiversity net gain. So I think that we would have an approach where I hope where we land is we have an approach where on-site mitigation has to happen unless there are very clear reasons why it could not, because it's just an easy get out. And also what we found is in the past, sometimes it just doesn't happen. And so also a biodiversity first approach. So the net gain, either, if it's on site, it comes with the development. It's difficult to do it before the development's done. Off site, you do the net gain first before you're allowed to build the houses.
And Alex, just to push on the very specific point on adequate resourcing as well.
I mean, the developers, they should adequately resource. I'm not even thinking that's a question. Yeah. I think maybe slightly different for social housing. I could say that slightly different social housing. But I think for private housing, that's definitely
Great, thanks, Alex. Helen, I wonder if I could turn to you next on the shareholder question.
Yep, very quickly. So I've been working on engaging public institutions for 12 years now. 12 years ago, when you mentioned the word nature, it was a completely blank look, and then a bit of a panic, and fiduciary duty used to get wheeled out. That's completely changed now. I think most people, not completely changed, but I think there's been a significant shift, particularly for pension funds, where they're having to look in the long term, they're having to steward their funds for 50 years, and they're seeing with the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, that they have to be thinking of shareholder value, thinking about ecological value, thinking about their wider impacts, not just profits, because they're seeing that over time, that's going to become more and more problematic. So I have seen a huge shift in that, but maybe Nick can talk a little bit more about that. I mean, one recent example is that there's a working group on pensions that is working on deforestation actively, and we've had one pension fund, Smart Pension, have publicly come out with a deforestation commitment that wouldn't have even felt possible even 3 or 4 years ago. And then briefly on the skills question, so as a slight aside, I did a part-time master's at the Open University quite recently on finance. Climate and environment wasn't mentioned once in the 5 years I was there. So I think on skills, I mean, again, Nick maybe can talk a bit more about this, but I think curriculum, capacity building, think about the business schools, all, you know, recent graduates who are going to be moving into finance sector, corporate jobs. Can we get climate and environment into those courses? I think is pretty essential.
Nick?
So starting with the shareholder point, I mean, yeah, really good point. I mean, we're a shareholder ourselves when it comes to our corporate holdings, and we use it to be an active shareholder to try and drive change. And we find that, you know, our focus is really as much as possible engagement over divestment, try and change those that have most impact on particular supply chains to prevent adverse environmental impacts. I think we have a job to do with other investors who follow a similar approach to us to really share those learnings with others, that you can really, through your position as a shareholder, drive change through your voting, through your everyday engagement. In fact, one of the things we put in place in 2021 was what we call our climate escalation engagement program, where we've picked the 30 most systematically carbon intensive companies in our portfolio, and we've set them very clear targets in terms of the climate ambitions we want them to adopt, and so we want them all to have net zero target independently verified by the SBTi, which is a science-based initiative on targets. We're asking them to have clear transition plans in place, so we understand what they're going to do by when to meet those net zero targets. We're asking them to be much more open in terms of their climate risk disclosure, and we're asking them as well to demonstrate evidence that they are lobbying governments positively in line with the 1.5 degree goal in the Paris Agreement. Now, that kind of really systematic engagement, which is really quite resource intensive, so you have to want to do it, but it really drives change. Already 2/3 of the companies that we set those challenges have now got science-based net zero targets. So it is bearing fruit. But I think the other point is the one that was just made, which is that ultimately it's not just an environmental and climate necessity. It just makes good business sense. If we want those businesses to be commercially viable in the future, they need to have a decent track record on emissions and on nature and biodiversity, commercially viable businesses. I think it's going to be very difficult for shareholders to hide behind that responsibility the more legislation evolves around the world on nature and on net zero. I think we are seeing a shift in the amount of shareholders who are doing this, and I'm going to decide to be positive, and more will take it going forward. Just on skills, I think that's a really important point. I think it's one of the most overlooked areas of climate and environmental policy. As an investor, one of the risks we see is that we have a whole bunch of skills gap here in the UK. Everything from grid, offshore wind, heat pump, insulation, nature restoration. And if we're not careful, if we don't plug the skills gap, it's going to be quite difficult to invest in UK-based supply chains for quite a lot of those things and create the green jobs that we keep talking about, because there won't be the people qualified to do it. So 2 years ago, I was on the Green Jobs Task Force. It was a cross-departmental task force. We put forward sort of 15 key recommendations to government, focused on both curriculum reform, higher education, but also we had a range of recommendations to support workers who work in sectors that are either in decline or where the nature of the work is going to change fundamentally, and who are going to need both financial and institutional support to gravitate towards new occupations. And we really need to sort of address those. So apparently we can expect a national skills action plan to come up at some point in 2024 that is supposed to address a lot of those questions. But if that's not the case, that for me would really be a priority for an incoming Labour government.
Great, thanks, Nick. And thanks everyone for all your questions. So at the start of the panel, we said we would talk about Labour's blueprint for a nature positive economy. We've gone into a lot of detail and a lot of very specific policies. So I want to just to sum up, if I can ask each of the panelists for one sentence, what's the one thing they really want to see in Labour's blueprint for this nature positive economy? If I start with Nick and work down.
I would like the blueprint to commit to incorporating the recommendations from the Dasgupta report report on nature, and in particular, it's still the same sentence, and in particular, include nature metrics in the tools that the Treasury uses when measuring economic performance and making economic policy decisions.
Thanks, Nick. Helen.
Yep, so I'd like the Labour government to reclaim the space as a leader in international climate and nature. And part of that is, I think, having a leading regulation on deforestation. But I think claiming that space and being consistent would be great.
Veronica.
I would like the UK to be a rule maker, not a rule taker, in terms of shaping deforestation regulation for the financial sector, which I'm sure is coming around the world. I would like them to put it in their manifesto and to deliver it, and for it to be a pioneering piece of legislation that shows the way for wider corporate sustainability due diligence.
Thanks, and Alex.
So, like the I've seen what's behind the curtain, and it is a big, expansive, ambitious program, including on nature. My real concern is about ability to deliver, and biggest gap for me isn't money, it's personnel and skills. So we need to have a big program of green skills right through the piece, and we need to resource that, get the training institutes up and running, improve the ag colleges and what they're doing and scale them up. And we need to resource that and have a focus on that, which isn't currently happening.
Great, thanks, Alex. So all that remains is to say thanks to all of you for coming. So I know it's very hot in here, so thanks for sticking with us. Thanks to Ken, Lisa, and the SERA team for hosting us today, and thanks to our amazing panelists.